Okay, we'll do that. That'll come back to you as part of the revisions. Next issue. Beg your pardon.
In terms of the red zone, so again, I'm not quite sure how far our remit goes, but I look at these maps and I look at the red zone and I go, well, it's a voluntary offer, but it's not actually a district plan zoning. So it's quite confusing to see the red zone on here, because red zone actually means nothing. It just means that, up until August, the government will give you a volunteer offer. But how do we, going forward, in part of this chapter, actually fill in those areas with the planning mechanisms? Why do we have them in here? Should we actually be taking them out?
We could do. It's under information only, those red zones. So the general public can relate the notations that we have for natural hazards to that area that's been red zoned by Sarah. But you're quite right, it is information only. They don't need to be in the planning maps.
Can I just say too that in communicating with the public that they have found it useful.
Right.
Because as I said, it is a little bit difficult to read these maps and to zoom into them, and they have found that useful in terms of context and trying to identify their properties.
So I presume the status of the red zone land is what?
We explain to people that is being developed by the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority under a separate process.
But in terms of planning, it
In
basically...
terms of our planning, it doesn't have any effect.
There's no...
We
whatever
have it there
zone...
for information only, and that's why...
we put over it, it's not excluded.
We've moved the Rockpool Hazard 1, for example, to represent the red zone, essentially. So the Rockpool Hazard 1 covers the red zone with issues of with ones to a cadastral boundary and the others aren't, but they have been reconciled to the red zone.
So where I've got red zone that has no cross hatch over it, what does that actually mean? Yeah. It just means you can just get consent.
As I explained earlier, the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority has different criteria for developing its red zone, and we're made aware of that. I think, in a general sense, while they haven't necessarily acknowledged it themselves, it's fairly obvious that they have. And that's a wide breadth of things, not just about the hazard, but also about social and economic issues. Both authorities have used, the council and that authority have used the same information to inform their mapping, but we've got different criteria that apply. So they've got other criteria that they apply. We've got the criteria under the Resource Management Act and the various statutory documents that have been developed under that Act, as well as the statutory documents prepared by the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority, including its recovery strategy and its land use recovery plan.
Let me maybe try to put it in a different way. If I'm a landowner in the red zone at the moment and I don't accept the volunteer offer from the Crown, and I'm living in my house, and I see I can subdivide, I can build 4 units, and if I look at this map, what does this actually tell me?
Well, they've actually said that. Some of those landowners have actually
47.
said, this is very helpful to us because we understand, although it's not necessarily what we want to hear, that gives us an understanding of what the council proposes doing with this land.
Sorry,
what I'm saying is,
I don't think that's the question being
if
asked.
If there's no cross-hatching or any kind of zoning...
Which map is that, councillor?
47. So you look at Martindale's Road, red zone there that's basically got, as far as I can tell, no sort of zoning over it, so I presume it just remains as living hills.
Well, of course, we haven't dealt with that Living Hills zoning yet, that's phase 2, but there is something there. There is both the liquefaction line, so that purple tooth line.
It's flatland red zone.
Yes,
Hills red zone.
So we've effectively got some liquefaction hazard identified there, and we've also got the green toothed area, which catches anything that's not mapped as cliff hazard, rockfall or mass movement. We've got that concern for those sloping areas, so we're also, at the time of subdivision, we'd require a geotechnical assessment of those areas.
That land is probably liquefiable, it's flat, that piece that you're looking at. So the information from GNS for the Port Hills is on sloping land. That piece that you're looking at, if I'm guessing it right, has been categorised worse than TC3, basically. So it's liquefiable land instead.
And we haven't come to that hazard yet.
How do I know?
Yes.
Yes, that
that's
first
right.
notation, if you go back to the legend and look for that liquefaction notation and the remainder of Port Hills, remainder of Port Hills and Banks Peninsula notation, so that's about, the liquefaction's at the top. Well, the liquefaction line approximately goes up to the 19-metre contour. So there's a little bit of arbitrariness there, but we're effectively, and it's also a bit difficult to show the notation clearly. So that's why effectively there's a gap there between the liquefaction and the remainder of the Port Hills control. But effectively they're lying together. For our planning purposes, we'd interpret them as one adjoining the other. And so one side of the line, and I mean, it's always a little bit arbitrary with these, any sort of mapping, especially if we're trying to map the hazard and the risk per se, rather than as it falls, rather than trying to bring it to the cadastral boundary. We're trying to be fair here, so we're just identifying where the hazard lies. I don't know. You'd have to ask Sarah about that, the organisation, Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority.
In a bigger context, if you haven't sold your land on any red zone, say for example in the east, you've kept it and you can now subdivide it into two because of the residential one changes. Are you able to do that? Do the current plan provisions apply if you're in the red zone, say the whole red zone?
We are coming to that in the presentation,
right.
But you'll be aware also that Sarah is shortly to go out on for consultation on the red zone proposals. Currently that's not under our jurisdiction, those areas that are red zoned in our district.
But they must be subject to some sort of plan at the moment.
They will be. As I've said, Sarah's about to go out on consultation.
No, I'm not worried about Sarah. If I want to do that now and I'm a red zone owner in Avondale, can I go and do what I want to do by just coming to the City Council?
No,
I can't do
because
anything?
if it's red zoned, that area is now under the jurisdiction of Sarah.
No, I haven't sold. It's a voluntary offer, I haven't sold. Let's just say. I mean, it's not a real...
Yes, the city plan still applies to it.
Right, thank you. Okay, right, excellent.
I think we need to get some really clear communication around, if I'm red zoned, here's what it actually means. We know that the revaluation has basically said that your land's worthless, but actually you can apply for a consent. If you get geotech support, you can build. So there just needs to be something that's really clear about,
but we haven't done that piece of planning work yet. That's in stage 2 of the chapters.
Yeah, I think it needs to be brought forward. That's my view.
Can't be. We haven't done that work yet, Councillor, because we haven't seen also what's being proposed by Sarah, but that is a part of stage 2.
It doesn't matter what Sarah do. Yeah. Well, and possibly because the offer's expired in the flat, actually it's more relevant to the people in the hills who urgently need to know, based on if we're going to rezone them from being able to do anything because they're in the red zone, or if we just need, because they still have a few months before the final.
That's correct.
offer.
That's why people are wanting to have this chapter out there and notified so that they can understand and have some certainty about what the council's wanting to do in these areas before they make their decision on their red zone offers.
And so that is why we've listed at the top of this slide relationship with Sarah Red Zone, and we certainly have had those concerns raised by us, not by a lot of people, but one or two have raised that, and they've said, well, this you know, it's not necessarily the information that I want to know, that I'm in a cliff collapse area, but it is useful to us to help us make a decision. Some of those people are very advanced, they've got geotechnical advice, they're talking to the Sarah geotech advisor as well as our in-house advisors, and they've engaged their own. Other people in this terrible sort of no man's land between EQC and the insurance company, and you know, being told to by the insurance company that they can rebuild their house, whereas their technical advice is telling them something different. There's every scenario you can think of, and so some of these people we've referred them to the community support side of the council, where we've had these issues raised. We've come back, we've talked with our in-house people like Ian and Peter Doolan, and we've worked through the processes. And so overall, and I conclude with saying that the feedback has been very positive, and I think we haven't had the degree of feedback that we've had for the flooding areas, but I think that's largely because there is a lot of communication going towards these people, and they are, a little bit more proactive generally than some people on the flat.
Right, one last hazard for us to cover before we finish this chapter. That's liquefaction. Who's speaking to that, Janice?
Very quickly, it's only a couple of slides on this one. You can click it on to the next. Yeah. Actually, that's not. My eyesight's not particularly good, but what we've done here is showing you the line that Yanni was talking about. Councillor Yanni was talking about before. The line going down Christchurch, dividing in the liquefaction areas. We've got this line here. Can you see that? This area is liquefaction assessment area 2, and most of the Christchurch City flat area is liquefaction assessment area 1. And I suspect the bit that Yanni was talking about was in this little bit in here, which was liquefaction assessment area 1. So what we've done is we've switched it around and said 1 means it needs more assessment, and then 2 is probably an area that liquefaction still needs to be assessed, but it's unlikely to be as troublesome as the... You want to be in 2. You want to be in 2. You want to be out to the west.
Only if you don't want liquefaction problems.
You want to be on the west, unless you might want to be in 1 if you can find a piece of TC3 land that's actually TC2 when you do your geotechnical report, because then that could be quite economically viable to build on. So, yeah, either way, the point being that we've divided the city into 2 assessment areas for liquefaction, but one of the changes that we've got in terms of the from the previous version of the chapter that we gave you was that we originally proposed that in LAA2 we'd continue with controlled subdivision activity status because, well, it's an area that's less affected, but in LAA1 it would be restricted discretionary activity to enable that application to be declined. Since that time, there has been a shift generally in how subdivision will be treated in the city, so that both areas are now restricted discretionary activity anyway. So that's one issue that has changed as a result of the way the plan has gone through. Alan, did you want to comment on why restricted discretionary is now throughout the whole city? So the distinction between the lines in terms of subdivision is of no real merit at the moment, except that when it comes to assessing those restricted discretionary subdivision applications, there's a little bit more onus in the LAA1 to get your geotechnical assessment done possibly more thoroughly and more boreholes and more work done to actually assess that liquefaction. If if you're in LAA2 and it's found to be very similar to some of the areas on LAA1, well then you'll still have to do the same level of liquefaction assessment to get your subdivision consent. So it's about the amount of information that is required between those 2 areas in terms of your subdivision consent. But in both cases, they can be declined. And then the other issue is, because of that, and discussions that we had with MB, we've done some tweaking to the information requirements. Right at the very end of the chapter, we've got information requirements for areas prone to liquefaction. We've amended that to be more consistent for subdivision, because they're both in the same area now for subdivision, but also to make it clearer.
In terms of our intention to create some further intensification around the key activity centres, what does this do? It presumably makes it much harder to subdivide.
Restricted discretionary activity means that the council can decline it, but in some of those intensification areas, there's a non-notification clause for the social housing and for the, what's the other one called? The CHD? There's a Houston development area. Yeah. Those 2 areas, what we've got, if you look at the rules, we've actually identified some intensive areas where we think that more assessment is needed in those areas. I'll just get the actual rule for you. Yeah, it's 5.9.3, page 25. And the rule basically says that when you're on the larger sites, like 1,500 square metres or more, and you qualify as a restricted discretionary activity for intensification under any of these rules that are listed, then these additional assessment matters on the right-hand side will need to be taken into consideration. So, and in terms of the enhanced development mechanism and the community housing redevelopment mechanism, there's also a clause on the left-hand side that says they won't require written approvals and shall not be publicly notified or limited notified. But for any other intensification caught by that rule, there's a potential for it to be notified. Yep, so it's an assessment matter. It's not changing the status. It's saying that if the residential section says that you can be a restricted discretionary activity to do these intensification projects, well then that's the same status. But we've added in this assessment matter just to make sure that liquefaction doesn't fall off the radar in terms of assessing a restricted discretionary activity, which you might recall, the council has to identify the matters that it's going to reserve its discretion over. And if we don't list liquefaction, then for these intensification areas, the council won't have any. Does anyone know how it's gone down with Sarah? We've actually reported it to Sarah and I think they've accepted it.
This is in alignment with MB requirements anyway, to have to do these kinds of assessments, geotech assessments.
Yeah. This has been to the Christchurch Joint Officials Committee, which includes Sarah, and they haven't raised an issue with this at this stage. That's your understanding, Ella?
That's right.
Yeah, but they haven't said they're concerned about it.
No.
It's just an assessment matter. It doesn't change the status of the activity.
So the areas that got really badly affected by liquefaction, I presume most of them, the worst ones would have been red zoned. So when I look at your map, if you could just flick back to the map of the city, what you're telling me is basically there's the west, which is generally L2.
Yep.
So that's, not as concerning. Then you've got the whole rest of the city is in the same category. Mm. So why wouldn't, in the red zones where you've had bad liquefaction, you have a third category that requires a much greater level of care or remitigation or whatever,
what we found
land remediation?
When we've had discussions with the MB, they have been very strong that we don't use their technical categories. So all the land in Christchurch has been technical categorised, 1, 2 and 3, plus the red zone is basically TC4, I suppose, if you're going to add that sort of philosophy to the red zone. So they've been quite strong in saying not to use those technical categories in the district plan. And there's good reasons for that, because this plan could go through challenge.
But I guess what I'm trying to understand is you've got really bad areas of the city in the red zone that don't seem to have any greater requirement than areas that are not red zoned, that are, so I don't, from a logical point of view, I don't understand that.
Well, I think, Brigitte, did you want to say something?
Well, that's what I was saying, that's part of the stage 2 when we're looking at the red zone flatland areas. We need to do the planning for that, and that planning is being kicked off by Sarah in this consultation phase that they're soon to undergo. That planning hasn't been completed yet, it's part of
I understand
stage
that. This actually has nothing to do with Sarah. This is our district plan, this is our hazard assessment, this is actually about the city's natural hazards.
Yep.
So the fact that Sarah are going to do a community engagement process, if I live in the red zone where I've had a voluntary offer and not accepted, I have just as much right to do something with my land as anyone else. Surely the information we've got, there's a reason why those properties have been red zoned, which I presume is because it's worse quality than the ones that are not red zoned. What I can't understand is why we as a council, in terms of the city, are saying, actually, the red zone is no worse than everywhere else in the east.
We're not actually saying that yet. We haven't done our planning yet. Just as we haven't done 13 other chapters for the district plan review, we haven't done that area yet of planning.
But so,
can I explain how
we bring that forward? Because it seems pretty fundamental that if people can get consents, and in the red zone they don't have to take into account natural hazards, that seems an anomaly.
No, I think the way it works, I'm not sure about the status of the red zone in terms of this draft chapter, but if the land was the quality of red zone, the geotechnical assessment would show that, and the council would be able to decline it. In the operative plan at the moment, it's a controlled activity, and the council can't turn it down. So what we've done here is say, well, actually, if we look at liquefaction assessment that the geotechs have given us, and it says, look, this land's just not suitable for subdividing, previously, the council would have to try and do something to put conditions on it to make it suitable, because in the controlled activity, that's all you can do. But with a restricted discretionary activity, the council can actually turn it down. And that's where we've moved forward from.
I understand that,
Yeah.
but what I'm saying is you've got a whole area in the east, which you've basically classified in this map as being the same. We know it's not the same because there's whole communities like Bexley that have been wiped out because of the earthquake, that have had to move because the risk, the hazard, the liquefaction has been too great. So how come there's nothing in our plan that shows that there is actually there is a higher area of natural hazard in certain areas?
So are you
when
suggesting that there be, it's about the planning response. You could say that some of those areas are so bad, if you knew they were so bad, that they shouldn't ever be developed on again, and then you're
Right.
into your cliff collapse.
So would Bexley,
rockfall.
Bexley's a really good example. So
Yeah.
from a, putting the, forget Sarah, forget the government, just from a city point of view, if a subdivision came in consent for Bexley, would you actually want to process it?
Well, you want to process it.
You'd say
because
it's too bad and we,
Well, how do you know until you've done this? All this does is say this is the assessment we want. So it's dividing the city into two levels of assessment. In this area, we want to be very clear that what the geotechnical assessment is saying about the land.
but what I can't understand is why is there no greater requirement for someone who wants to subdivide in Bexley as there is for Wolston?
Well,
or
this is
for-
only about the assessment and the status. So it's not saying that any of the land's any good at all. It's saying we want the assessment appropriate to the site. So if you're on good land, the assessment will indicate that it's very suitable. If you're on bad land, the assessment will indicate that the council shouldn't grant consent.
Then why not just have one assessment across the city?
Well, we've only got two, and one's saying you have to pay, it's to do with how much you pay for your geotechnical assessment. On one side of the line, you might get away with doing a little bit less because you're in that area where liquefaction's unlikely. On the other side, you're going to have to do a reasonable amount of assessment to show that it's actually suitable for development. Whether you're close to Bexley or close to the airport, on that line, you're going to have to show your land's suitable. So all this is doing is not identifying areas of the city that are more prone to liquefaction than others. It's actually just showing what level of assessment the council will want when it comes to assessing resource consent applications. So it doesn't say this is a liquefaction hazard area. That's not what it's doing. It's saying for resource consents, this is the level of assessment that we want. There's
would
no
you
reason
not
why
gra-
you couldn't.
Okay.
Just quick. So earlier on, we were told, if you could find a little section of TC3 land, it's actually TC2, and it's going to be more economical to build on it, etc. Technically, we could actually find, if you were lucky enough to find a section in the red zone at the moment under this, which happened to be just a little island of firm land, you could actually get consent.
Does this apply? Does this plan apply?
I mean, the geotechnical assessments that we're having done for some of these areas on the periphery, they're looking at new zoning will be included in potentially in the future urban development areas, are saying the thing that's typical across the whole city is variability. And some of these geotechs that have worked all over the world, they said they've never seen anything like it. So that's reinforcing what you're saying, that what we need here is a process, but we don't want to ring fence areas, because there is that level of variability.
But I guess that's where the confusion is, because the government's ring fence the red zones, and we're not.
For a wide range of purposes,
Yeah,
it's not just about the liquefaction issue.
Okay, so that's-
Councillors, might assist or assist me anyway, if I just take this back a little bit to the legal framework for both the red zone and what we're doing here. The red zone is a line that shows where the government has offered to buy land. Now, the reason the government offered to buy that land is partly to do with the extent of geotechnical risk, and there's a number of other criteria that central government used in deciding whether to make that offer. So that's what the red zone is. There's been no change there's been no moratorium on processing of resource consent applications. There's been no change to the district plan provisions about how someone has a permitted activity to do whatever activity is permitted in the plan at the moment in the red zone. There has been some tinkering with the plan provisions to do with things like earthworks, repair of land and that sort of thing, but there's been no change to the underlying zoning of that land in the current plan. So if it was zoned residential and it's been red zoned, it's still zoned residential. Now that's what the current plan says. What we're looking at here is the future plan, and at the moment we're looking at the hazards chapter in the future plan. So we've got in here what is being proposed by officers for the natural hazard provisions in the future plan, but not the underlying zoning. So this is just about those natural hazard provisions for the future plan. What Brigitte has highlighted is that at phase 2 of the district plan review, the idea is that the council will decide what it wants to go into the plan in terms of zoning for the red zone areas. So that's not, there's been no proposal put up by officers at this stage for zoning in those red zone areas. Now we all know that Sarah's going through, we all know that Sarah's going through this consultation process so that central government and its agents can decide what it would like to see happen for the zoning of the red zone area. That's going to be relevant to this council's decision on what it puts in the plan at phase 2 for the zoning for those areas. And it's up to you how you deal with that or that sorted out. But in terms of helping landowners identify what the zoning of their red zoned land will be in the future, we haven't got to that point yet. I'm not sure whether that's answered your question, Councillor.
I guess I'm worried about the message that to say to the people in the red zone or the people on the flat next to the red zone, actually your property, you just need to do the same level of assessment as if you're in the red zone, or the red zone needs to do the same level of assessment as you. And
no,
I
the
kind
level
of,
of assessment depends
guess,
on the geotechnical report is what determines how much assessment needs to be done, because as soon as they start doing their work and realise what the quality of the land is, then that assessment has to become more and more thorough, and MB's got some quite strong guidelines about that. We've tried to put some of those guidelines into the plan.
And we've drilled on like all these properties that had drilling done, so we must have a huge database of knowledge about land conditions in certain areas.
We do,
Yeah,
but
we
the
do.
variability from site to site remains.
Yeah, okay.
The other thing is, I think the difference between this particular hazard and the other hazards that we've been looking at is what can be done, what technology is available, and that, in terms of our Section 32, that's going to have to come into it. Why would we prohibit, for example, TC3 land from being developed when we know that there's foundations and ground improvements that are currently being devised that can actually make them able to be used? And that might even be in the future when the red zone's decided, might be the same case. Pardon?
That's right.
And
No, I'm saying the scenario
yeah, and
is...
that's my point.
So really just to throw something else into this discussion, unless there's something that I've missed, and by way of illustration, if we compare map 26 with map 47, there seems to be an anomaly in the mapping, because on map 26 we've got red zoned areas which haven't got the minimum floor level overlay, presumably because they're red zoned, whereas on the Rockfall map on page 47 we do show the Rockfall 1 and Rockfall 2 over the red zoned land. So it certainly looks as though we're saying that red zoned land on the flat is excluded from our considerations in this chapter, whereas the red zoned land on the hills is not excluded from our considerations. And what if you actually read the map exactly the way it is, quite literally, you would say, well, the red zoned land on the flat is capable of being developed without any reference to the minimum floor level overlay, whereas land which isn't red zoned must have the minimum floor level overlay. Whereas on the hills, you need to have regard to the rockfall risk because that's shown on the map. So there seems to be an anomaly there that I think people would find quite difficult to understand.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we'll have to address which way we're going to show it, but my understanding was that because these rules didn't apply to the red zone, that it didn't have to be shown. But I see what you're saying, that we've got information only. If you look at the legend, you said information only, that's the red zone is shown as information only in the legend. But here, if that's the case, there should be the ponding area should be switched on under the red zone, if that's the case. So I agree with you.
Yeah, now that makes perfect
So
sense, because if it is technically possible to build on red zoned land, you would expect that building to be subject to, in the map 26 example, the minimum floor level overlay.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree that it's a matter of switching it on or switching it off, and it's got to be consistent.
Consistency.
Yeah.